We have this idea that people with dark personality traits must be secretly miserable, right? That if someone's narcissistic or manipulative, they've got to be wrestling with a ton of depression and anxiety. But what if that's not the whole story? What if it's way more complicated? Let's dive into a psychological mystery that really flips that whole idea on its head. And that brings us to the big question, the one that's stumped psychologists for a long, long time. It's that classic chicken or egg scenario. Do these dark traits cause things like depression and anxiety? Or does feeling depressed and anxious actually start to bring out these darker traits in people? Which one is driving the bus?
So, to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to follow along with a pretty fascinating scientific investigation. It put three very specific personality traits under the microscope. So, let's go ahead and meet our three main suspects in this mystery.
Okay, first up, we've got narcissism. This is the one you probably hear about the most. It's that grandiose sense of self-importance, That feeling of being superior to everyone else, having a real sense of entitlement, and just constantly needing admiration.
Our second suspect is Machiavellianism. Now, this trait is all about cold, hard strategy and looking out for number one. It's defined by a manipulative way of dealing with people, a pretty cynical view of the world, and a laser focus on personal gain, no matter who gets hurt in the process.
And rounding out our trio is psychopathy. Now, we're not talking about movie villains here, we're talking about subclinical traits. This is characterized by a real lack of empathy and remorse, combined with impulsivity, a tendency to manipulate others, and often a kind of chaotic, erratic lifestyle. So how in the world do you solve a mystery like this one? Well, just taking a quick snapshot of someone at one point in time, that's not going to cut it. To really figure out the cause and effect here, researchers knew they had to follow people over a long period of time, and they needed a very special kind of tool to do it. So, the investigation they set up was a 3-year-long study. They tracked over 1,800 university students, checking in on their dark triad traits and their symptoms of depression and anxiety once every single year. This long-term view is absolutely the key, because it lets you see how things actually change and influence each other over time. Now, here's where this study got really clever, and why it's such a big deal. The source material points out that a lot of older research had a major flaw. They would basically mix up two totally different kinds of information, which could lead them to some really wrong conclusions about what causes what. So these researchers used a model that separates those two things. Think of it like using two different camera lenses. The first lens looks between people. It's comparing the stable average differences between folks, like is person A generally more narcissistic than person B over the long run? But the second lens, the really powerful one, looks within a person. It tracks the ups and downs for one individual over time. So did person A's narcissism spike this year compared to their own usual level? That distinction right there is the secret to cracking this case. And when they used this powerful new approach, wow. The findings for our first suspect, narcissism, were genuinely surprising. It did not behave at all like you might think. Okay, so here's the first huge reveal. When a person had a temporary spike in their narcissism, meaning they were acting more narcissistic than they usually do, it actually predicted that they would have fewer symptoms of depression and anxiety the next year. It's like a temporary boost in that grandiose self-image acted as a shield against feeling bad later on. And get this, it went both ways. When a person had a spike in their anxiety or depression, it predicted a decrease in their level of narcissism the following year. It seems that feeling genuinely distressed can kind of knock that grandiose self-perception down a peg. So the crucial thing to see here is that it's a dynamic two-way street.
But what about our other two suspects, Machiavellianism and psychopathy? Well, for them, the story was completely different.
For these two traits, the connection to mental distress was only concurrent, and that just means it was happening at the exact same time. There was no predictive link. A spike in psychopathy this year didn't predict you'd feel more depressed next year, or vice versa. The connection only existed right in the here and now. And this shows that in-the-moment connection perfectly. When a person's level of Machiavellianism or psychopathy went up, so did their symptoms of distress at the very same time. You can see the link was there for Machiavellianism, but for psychopathy, it was a really strong, simultaneous connection. All right, so after our 3-year investigation, after looking through all the evidence, what's the final verdict? What's the real relationship between the dark triad and our mental health? Here it is, the final breakdown. When you look between people,
Yeah, all three traits are generally linked with more symptoms, and especially psychopathy. But the real story, the one we've been hunting for, is in those within a person changes. Only narcissism has that weird, predictive seesaw relationship over time. A spike in narcissism one year predicts feeling better the next. But for Machiavellianism and psychopathy, the link is purely in the moment. They rise and fall together, side by side.
So why does all of this matter? What's the big takeaway? Well, for one, it shows that the link between our personality and our mental health is not some simple one-way street. It's incredibly dynamic. It suggests that, as strange as it sounds, a temporary flare-up of narcissism might actually be a coping mechanism, a way of shielding ourselves from distress. And maybe most importantly, this proves we absolutely cannot just lump these dark traits together and call it a day. They behave very, very differently when it comes to our inner well-being. And that leaves us with a pretty fascinating final thought, doesn't it? This whole study worked because it could separate a person's stable, long-term traits from their temporary, fluctuating states. But in our own lives, how do we tell the difference? What parts of who we are fixed and stable, and what parts are just shifting and changing with the tides of our life? It's a pretty profound question about who we really are deep down.